My name is Schalk Neethling, and this is the Mechanical Ink podcast, a podcast about open source, the open web, sustainability, and those who want to make the web and the world a better place. Hey, Anna, and welcome to the Mechanical Ink podcast.
Hey, Schalk. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while. So, as I generally do with these recordings, there's nobody better to introduce you than yourself. So I'm going to get out of the way, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Just a couple of things I want to throw out that you could touch on, if that makes sense to you, is essentially tell us a little bit about you, the work that you do. Then what gets you up in the morning? That's always something that I find curious. And then there was this little thing, as I like to read about the people that I'm going to talk to. So I do some research and some looking around in people's profiles and stuff. And I noticed this interesting thing. And that is that there's quite a few folks on LinkedIn, and you're one of them. And then Seth Godin was another one that has this little waxing gibbous moon next to their profile, their name. And I was curious if that has any specific meaning. So if you want to touch on that as well as part of your introduction.
Okay. Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm a little bit of new territory with you and your open source world. And so this is exciting to be combining and seeing kind of different ecosystems intertwine, which they do, and they should. And so that's fun. So yeah, I'm Anna Smith. I am, let's see, just to begin, so I live and work in Iquitos, Peru, which is the largest city in the Peruvian Amazon, which is, people love to brag and go on about how it's the largest city in the world not accessible by car. So you have to get here by boat or by plane. It makes it kind of feel like it's sort of 50 years in the past, and maybe anciently in the past, and certain kind of other topics in terms of traditional cultures, which we're surrounded by. But so I live and work here. I've lived and worked in Peru for almost 7 years, and I'm from the US, but I've really kind of been able to create this cool, interesting life here, and that's a big part of what gets me up in the morning. So my background, I have a long history of working in global health, in women's health and sexual health. I worked in the States and lived in the States until I was 33, doing a lot of focus on high-need community work, and STD prevention, sexual education, high-risk pregnancy, clinic stuff. I moved to Peru in my early 30s and switched tracks into sort of the internationalism life mode. And now I do a whole lot of different kinds of things, a combination of sort of a really active creative life, which I can talk more about, which is a huge part of what gets me up each day, and this incredible, ongoing, delicious contribution that we get to have by being alive and having this will and interest in engaging in community. And so you asked about the waxing gibbous moon, which is a symbol for the carbon almanac, which and just to kind of clarify, so that icon refers to the stage of the moon before the moon becomes full. So it's coming into its own. It's actually in its stage. It's between coming into it and being in its full development. It's growing, and that's the significance of the icon, and that's a big part of the kind of symbol of a tribe of the community, which has been pretty much a plugged-in network for me and a connecting force for me in my life. In many different ways, which we can talk about community, but that's definitely a big part of what gets me up in the morning.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, what is it like? So I think let's maybe dig into it from this point of view. What brought you to Peru specifically? Is it the forest, or is it that plus some other things? And how'd you end up in a city that's so as you said, it's not accessible by car, you have to take a boat or a plane. How'd you end up specifically there?
Of all the places, of all of this big world we live in, why am I here? I think it's, you can hear this, it's thundering outside, but I think for me, there's maybe just certain people. I think we all kind of have these sort of aspects of ourselves or multiple kind of elements of personality where there's different kinds of needs we want to get met in life at once, right? We have desires for community and connection. We have desires for intimacy. We have desires for home and stability. We have desires for newness and learning. And to me, Peru, and I think a lot of people throughout time have seen Peru as this treasure to be discovered, this promised land of ancient wisdom and the place to get healing. It's still very popular among tourism for that. And for me, the Dorada Peru was really more about having a really rich and cool life. I knew I could do really great global health work here, and I knew I could have this rich bilingual life. Peru is home to an incredible number of different ecosystems, microclimates. And so I knew I could have a huge amount of variety living here. And I think, not to mention that I just really connect with a lot of aspects of Latin American culture, in particular warmth and the emphasis outside of the individual and more on the collective, on the community, which is basically the life force of social life here is the collective. So all those reasons drew me down here. I knew I could have a really great quality of life. I think, and a lot of people who do international development work, there's a certain level of, okay, you're living in a country that you're not from. You're very intentionally in this specific place. Hopefully you have a combination of factors that nourish you. And I think that's, for me, a big part of why here, Iquitos in particular, people say this about the Amazon region, which includes Colombia and Brazil too, is it's particularly warm. It's a particularly warm population. People are, I don't know, there's a kind of essential sense of cultural openness and receptivity that I find unique in other parts of the world. And I find it really nourishing, a sense of home base too. And I think that's a big part of why I'm here.
The more I read about you and the work you do and the interests you have and things you write about and talk about and that kind of thing, it like all circles around a couple of topics for me anyway. And so some of those topics that I've picked up on is the planet, and then empathy and respect, which I think you've just mentioned, and then living a creative life just in general. So I wonder, I think you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can dig even a little bit deeper into that. Why do you feel drawn to those topics? And then why are they important now, where we are in the history of the planet and civilization in general?
Such a great and thoughtful question. I think we've seen what happens when we focus exclusively on ourselves. I think the history of sort of Western civilization in particular, on extraction, on a type of capitalism that has a very short-term sight, has brought us to a lot of points that we're currently at. And I think there's reasons why those things have happened. I'm not discounting that those aren't valid and haven't offered certain kinds of progress. But I think we're also feeling the emptiness and the loss and the distancing that comes with that. And I think it's at a point now where it's so strong that we are kind of forced to reconcile and reckon with what we're losing by exclusively focusing on that. And I don't mean that just in terms of ecology, which is obviously a crisis, but like socially too. What is the aspect of our society that does not nourish the inner life? When everything we're putting on social media and Instagram, so I avoid a lot of these things is because there's other aspects of self that go missing. And so I think we've just reached a point in human history where we have enough access to each other and the tools to. I think the pandemic was really helpful in the massive pause that we needed to take. Sorry, my window is rattling crazy. It's really windy. And so I think that was a really important part of our ability to sit with things. And I think just also like our ability to be connected in new ways facilitates that openness. I think a lot of people too are sort of recognizing that wealth comes in the collective rather than just in the individual and in the specific. So we are actually nourished not by being alone, but by our connections to each other and this whole crisis of loneliness that we're seeing, like I think that's a forced, or the fact that there's so many more natural disasters, we're forced to connect with each other and support each other. The fact that we feel worse after being on social media and we feel more alone is maybe nudging us to consider that's not really serving it and what else. So I think several merging forces have come together. And obviously, like the urgency around having a stable future, I think is coinciding with that, remarkably at the same time, it feels like a really remarkable time to be alive, to be in the middle of this. And it requires a different set of skills as a person that I don't think, I can definitely say my grandmother wouldn't have probably needed to develop in her life. My life might have been richer for it, but it wasn't necessary in the same way. And I think our ability to collaborate and to extend, which is a big part of my connection with Seth's work and my friendship with him, and and really the whole community, all of us, you included, like our connection to each other is offers such nourishment in our lives, especially in digital spaces with so much more time spent working from home. I think these things have all conspired. And I think what's exciting too, honestly, about it is it could have gotten differently. It could have felt like, oh, I'm just at home, I'm alone, I kind of feel worse. And if I'm at home alone, I'm connected to you and this amazing podcast you do, like that offers me a different experience. And you get to feel that and experience that, and then that leads you down a new path. That's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of what you said resonates with me, and at the same time, I, I, I look at the world and I look at what's happening around me, like in South Africa specifically, and um, I'm not exactly sure how to put this, but I do sense that we are starting to realize that we can't go at this alone. Like the future success, the future, just our ability to have some kind of hope and dream and believe that there is a tomorrow that's worth living for, does depend on more than just me, more than just each individual. It is coming together. That's what makes it worthwhile. But at the same time, it feels like there is so much anger in the world. If I look around me, I see that on people's faces. I see that in interactions you have. It seems like people have a very, very short fuse. Um, so I don't know. Do you think that maybe we have this? Is it that we have this pull towards, almost like a pull towards the kind of life that you've kind of set up for yourself, where you're closer to nature, closer to a community that is open and nourishing. So we're kind of feeling the pull towards that, but then this capitalist like got to do this has to have been done like 2 weeks ago, this rush towards something, and we're not always even sure what that is. Um, could it be that this pull is becoming so strong that we feel pulled in two different directions, and we're sitting in the middle and we're feeling frustrated and we don't know how can I free myself, in a sense, from this pull and move towards the thing that I really want to do, which is live a more creative life, live a more meaningful life, live a life that is closer to nature. Do you think that is maybe something that is having this side effect?
Yeah, I think you put it beautifully. I do think there's that. I mean, I think we've grown up in culture. We've grown up, right, as fish are in water. We've grown up within certain structures and capitalistic systems and extractive systems, and where the more than human world is not recognized, is not valued, it's used only. And I think that there is that inner turmoil that comes, because I think there's a part of us that deeply longs for the elements that are beyond that. that have to do with, you said, the more that are way beyond me, that are more than me. That really, I am a part of it, and you are a part of it, but they're not us exclusively. And then getting off of the I to the we, the me to the me, the we to the me is like such a huge part of this transformation. And I think that that's painful for people. Like I think that there's a surrender of the ego that we weren't taught how to do, how to let that go. And I think that's hurts, you know? It's scary when this essential structures of what we thought meant to be successful, you know, which meant I'm going to promote myself, I'm going to advance in this business, I'm going to make this money, I am going to this Western notion, which not everybody in the world shares, right? That's it's one specific construct, but and when that slowly starts to fade or slow down, I think that's disorienting, you know. And what you need is something else that feels strong, you know, stable, and that in the same way that, like, you know, when I was learning and overcoming or struggling with this perfectionism, and I had to find a new identity that worked out of I'm not wrong because I don't know. What I am is actually an active learner, and that's my new identity that I shifted to versus being I don't know what I am, you know? And I think what I hope for people and what I feel like you're involved with and a lot of us are involved with is helping people shift that identity to the meaning of not just taking all of it for myself, but for thinking in the collective. And I think, but I do think that's a painful process. And I think that there's a lot of grief in letting go of old systems. You know, I think the status quo exists so strongly because it works in certain ways. It helps us feel secure in certain ways, and the emotional labor of letting a lot of that go is labor. It hurts. So I don't know. I want to honor that own those processes. I think for a lot of people in particular, I mean, at least where I live, like I look at the way, for example, like for example, where the way kids are in school here, like if how much my Peruvian friends struggle to speak to me in English. They are so afraid, despite years of friendship, a lot of trust, to make a mistake. And how difficult that wiring, how deep that wiring is, and they cannot say a single incorrect phrase to me in English. Here I am, we're having drinks. It's casual, and that's still so programmed in there that we can't engage in that way. And I wonder how long those things take to change. You know, like how much trust, you know, how much time. Some people I just feel like really struggle with that. I don't know. But I think there's just a lot of space for patience and grace too, like with it, because I think there's no other way it's going to work. No amount of yelling at yourself is going to move that faster. You know, I know you focus on mental health too. That's a big topic, right? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's massive. That's massive. And I think a lot of this, like you said, this whole idea of um, I mean, I guess this plays into the whole influencer culture where there's this one individual that everybody looks to for, you know, guidance and answers and stuff like that. But then, you know, behind the camera, their life is not the life that they put forward on these social media channels. Um, that's why I appreciate it when some of these people do zoom out in a sense so that you can see, you know, the little space you see on the camera normally is very intentionally structured to look a certain way. But if you just zoom out a little, it's like it's a mess around it, like everybody else's homes or spaces. Um, because I think, you know, a lot of people get really down on themselves because they haven't achieved what it seems like the world is telling them they should have achieved by a certain age, or, you know, I don't know. I mean, I struggle with these things sometimes. So much of our worth is connected to our careers sometimes, or, you know, where you live, or what you have or don't have for that matter.
learning, it's a big change. It's a big process. And no amount of like being angry with yourself or other people will make that easier. You know, I think there just has to be a different kind of way it's approached. Even if you grew up in a perfectionistic family and they told you should just be able to do all of it perfectly and you can't, you're like, well, so then what do I do? You know, how do I learn this as an adult, you know?
No, for sure. I mean, yeah, your identity is oftentimes very closely bound to that. And so when that goes away, aspects of your identity goes away, and that stuff. That's that ego thing that you mentioned, where there's a bit kind of breakdown of the ego, and that that is from a like mental health perspective. That is a hard thing to deal with. That's a hard thing to accept.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not saying that there aren't things that sometimes have to be taken from people. Like I think sometimes power has to be reached out and grabbed when it isn't voluntarily given, but still, and that's still it's still a hard process.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, it definitely is. It is. So, um, one of the nonprofits that's listed on your LinkedIn bio is called Nonprofit Ventures. I've never heard of them before, but I'm curious because I had a look at their website, and they talk about this idea called post-growth entrepreneurship or the post-growth economy. I'd love if you can dig into that a little bit and just explain what that is all about and what do nonprofit ventures do.
Yeah, that's a great. I'm happy to talk about them. So, um, as a relative newbie to that world myself, so post growth economics is basically the idea that it's kind of better and not necessarily bigger. You can have thriving without endless amounts of growth. That there's sort of people's needs versus corporate greed. We have this collective well-being, which does have to exist within limits, right? But the focus should be not necessarily on the straight line up of endless growth, endless consumerism, which does not work, but to do it as more focused on thriving. And sort of it's connected to the idea of broaden economics, where there's that space in between the ecological limits of the planet and the social needs of humanity in a more than human world, and we can finding ourselves within that specific space. So the post-growth entrepreneurship incubator, which is what I completed this year, it was completed with a woman named Melanie Ryback, who is a pioneer and a hero, and she created radically open security. So so basically the idea behind her business and many others in this post-growth kind of model is that they're non-extractive models. They're post-capitalistic models. So the income just to briefly explain, that means that like when you have the lemonade stand as a little kid, and the amount of money that you get at the end of that, that actually either goes back into the company that's reinvested in the social good of the company. That's one option, or another is that it just is given away to foundations or to charities. But that's not, people don't get rich. I mean, what people are allotted is amounts to live well, to live, fairly more than that, abundantly, but not necessarily exponentially, too much. And so the idea would be to be creating businesses that have those kinds of models. And there's a lot of different kinds of, that often requires legal entities in terms of how businesses are structured, who are the owners of businesses, how can businesses be sold, that kind of thing. And so post-growth is kind of an interesting conversation regarding how to create economic structures that within the living viability of our, of a livable planet, but are still would be venturing into new types of business, new territories. And I think, and kind of what it would be contrasted against is a Silicon Valley model, which ends up often being really bad for founders and kind of a losing game a lot of times, and so as an alternative to that.
Yeah, it makes me think maybe I haven't heard it using this exact terms that you've just used, but I spoke to a friend of mine some times ago that lives in Colorado, and he mentioned about this idea of a business that is not owned by any one person, but it's owned by everyone. So like nobody works at the company and nobody outright owns the company either. It's collectively owned by everybody. So the success or failure rests on everybody's shoulders. If this thing succeeds, everybody succeeds together. If it fails, everyone fails. So everybody kind of shares that responsibility, which is a really interesting model. And then I think it's the founder of, is it Patagonia, the clothing line, I think, who essentially gave away everything. Like he walked away from the company and gave away everything to fight climate change, which is just like, wow. He's like, I have enough. I have a place to live. I don't need all this money. Here it is. Use it to fight climate change. I think that was really inspiring when I heard that.
I guess the question too is, what is at what point, when do humans thrive? When is it enough for us to have the full level of our thriving, our human capital potential realized? And at what point, like, is it too much? We get into a territory of, and I'm not suggesting, like, I've been thinking about this a lot, this whole question about more and less and better, and I don't think selling people on the idea of less of something is probably going to get us very far, right? But the idea of thinking about better or more of a better option, I think probably makes as a greater selling point. And so, yeah, this is there are post growth is not the only option, but it's one that's really resonated for me, and I'm currently developing a business concept, and then I did in the business incubator using the post growth structure. And so kind of my personal desire coming from the global health world and public health world was to not spend the rest of my life like so many people would be groaning and rolling their eyes and agreeing with me, looking for grants and funding, but wanting to find using business actually as a tool for activism and social change, which is I think a pretty revolutionary concept, and full of potential.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the open source world is struggling with that at the moment as well, where I think the underlying concepts are sound and good, but I think but the thing that went wrong is where the expectations is just misaligned. Where you are a corporate company who makes literally millions or billions of dollars, and almost everything that you have is built on top of open source. And then you have a certain expectation of people that are maintaining the software freely, whether it be individuals or communities of people. You place an expectation on them as if you're paying for that, but you're not. And you're not even contributing back to it by improving it through documentation, code, design, whatever the thing might be. And now that a lot of these maintainers are saying, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I'm burning out. I need to find a way to make this sustainable for myself. And one of the ways to do that is to start asking money for the work I do, to start finding a way to build a business model around this open project or this open source framework or whatever it is that I'm building. And people are very unsure how to deal with this. People are exploring different licensing models, and some are more successful than others. And some of them, I will say, is going too far to the other side again. We have to watch that we don't just swing the pendulum all the way from the one to the other side, that we kind of find this happy middle. So yeah, the open source world is definitely struggling with this as well, and trying to find that happy middle. And we're not there yet by any stretch of the imagination.
At least for a lot of people too, there's a lot of hesitation because how, the idea, especially like, I don't know, it's coming from the US, like, if I don't have a certain amount of money, I've set apart for my life. And I understand this argument and I respect this concern enormously. If I don't extract from my own business, if I don't extract from this open source code thing that I use as a platform, and I don't make money, how am I going to retire? How am I going to have money for the future? How am I going to be sure about certain things? And those are all really valid concerns. But I do think there's a huge amount of room in there for, especially, frankly, among certain countries that have more socialized healthcare and things, that there are better social structures in place in which people can rely on things, to set it up differently. So, yeah, I respect that.
Yeah, that's a big problem. I think the fact that some of this was kind of opened up and made more visible during COVID, as you've mentioned, um, because people have realized how closely tied their ability to just survive is to their employment at a specific company. When you lose that, you don't only lose your paycheck, but you lose your pension, you lose your medical aid, um, and you have a family that relies on you being able to take care of them, and also you might have a partner, you might have children or anything like this that have health issues that is expensive to take care of. And if you've relied on this one entity to fund all of this, when that goes away, you find out how unpredictable your life actually is, and how on a like knife's edge you're walking constantly, where you were thinking that you were very safe. And that in itself is a struggle. And that's why I think in countries where the government can actually can and do take care of their citizens, it does open up some opportunities for you to be a little bit more, be freer in a sense. I know for me in South Africa, we don't have like the government system is very broken at the moment. And so you are heavily dependent on yourself and your financial situation to be able to take care of yourself and your family and your home and all these kinds of things. And that places a massive burden on yourself, because now, more often than not, you're not making money to live a lavish life, or go out to restaurants and go on holidays and all these things. You're making money to be able to put food on the table, be able to go to a decent doctor in a hospital if that the need arises, and have a possibility of potentially at some point saying, you know what, I don't have to work this hard anymore. I can kind of take it easier, and you have a kind of pension and that kind of stuff. That's your responsibility. You have to take care of that. And it's not cheap. It's expensive. It's very expensive.
And we see that, I mean, that's true, right? What you're saying in South Africa, I mean, that's true all throughout the world. I mean, that's true even in the US, being as, GDP being what it is, but it's still true. People cannot rely on social systems to not bankrupt them if they get sick. I mean, it's better than it was in certain ways, but it's still not. At least where I live here in the Loreto state of Peru, the Amazonian state of Peru, like people do not have. They can't trust in basic systems even related to water or electricity, right, to be able to function. So everything relies not. But this is one of the points of teaching it. People shouldn't have had to get to this point to rely on it. There is some beauty in the structure itself, but the mechanism and the poverty that's required it is atrocious. It is interesting though, because what ends up happening is that the communities themselves become the lifeblood of being able to survive or not. If you don't participate in the community, you don't survive. Versus, in the States or, in other parts of the world, it's like you can choose whether or not to do it, because there's a certain level of economic options, whereas here that means survival. Family, if you don't participate in these structures, you don't survive. And so there's a different level of option given, but the mechanisms I think still often work the same in terms of the way people rely on each other and the structure of that network itself. So being from the U.S. and living in a place like this gives me enormous perspective, and I think it's makes me a lot more critical of. I mean, really of both sides. I'm not saying I have one specific kind of opinion or another, but I think it's humbling to live biculturally or cross-culturally. It opens me up, and there's a huge amount of gray inner territory in my own life that I don't think I would have experienced had I not. Kind of like that gray area, like that sort of unknown textured zone where you're like, oh, this is. I think there's a lot of relevant conversations to be having, and there isn't one. And I think when I look at the way a lot of in the US, reporting or news happens, it's so often lacking any level of perspective of what it would be like in any other part of the world. And I find that really bothersome. I feel like it's feels very egocentric. It's like the only country that we're interested in is this one. And I think that comes maybe from being an expat, and probably a lot of people who live in other places, that you get that perspective. And many of them without having chosen to live there. They had to leave, right? So that's part of it too.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. I've seen that quite a bit, where people have actually called that out, where something would happen somewhere else in the world, and there'd be very little coverage about that, and then something happens in certain parts of the world, and it's the biggest news story of the week and of the day kind of thing, and it's like it's an interesting balance that we have there. I want to touch on community quite a bit because you've brought that up quite a lot. But before we move on to that, I do want to talk about two, I'm going to call them projects, that I know you're involved with, that are, I think, closely aligned with one another. And so the one is called the Earthwork Collective, where you are a council member, and then the other is the Carbon Almanac, where you are a contributor. And I've mentioned Seth Godin at the top of the conversation, and this is something that I learned from the Akimbo podcast. That is Seth Godin's podcast. I learned about it there, and when I first heard about it and I had a quick look, I thought, oh, it's a book. And then I was like, okay, that's cool. I'm interested in reading the book. But then the more I've heard from people like yourself and Saurabh and some other folks, I was like, wait a minute, it's more than a book. And so I'm curious if maybe you want to just like start from Earthwork Collective and like what you're doing there, what you're doing as a council member there, and then maybe circling around to the Carbon Almanac.
I want to kind of invert them because one led to the other. So I could start with the Carbon Almanac that led to the creation of Earthwork. So the Carbon Almanac is basically is and was a collective of people who believe that it's not too late to solve climate change. And when I say that, I'm not speaking in super literal terms. I'm talking about the sense of collective ability to take action and the fact that there's a lot that can be done right now and that needs to continue to be done today and going forward. So it's rooted in the idea that by talking about climate change, we change the culture, and in changing the culture, we can affront incredibly enormous, complicated, systematic global problems. So by talking, we change the culture, and in changing the culture, we can affront problems. And how do people talk? Well, when they know enough to talk about something, when they have some level of a small amount of information. When I took a very essential knitting class and got the basics of knitting, I could just begin to talk about knitting a little bit. I had enough information just to do something, to feel like I'm not a complete idiot talking about it. It's something to work with. And the idea behind the almanac is and was to provide a platform of factual information in which people could begin to talk about climate change. So what is carbon in the atmosphere? What is biodiversity? Why is that so important? What are the ways in which like the ocean currents, how are those connected in terms of the way heat is distributed throughout the planet? How do the ice caps work? What's the ozone? How does that factor in? All these kinds of things that until you understand kind of the basic carbon cycle and the way that carbon is sequestered in relation to the atmosphere, it's kind of hard to understand other things. It's actually fairly simple to understand. It's not a super specific, difficult concept, but it requires a level, frankly, like kids' book level understanding. So when I was first learning about this, I actually read the Carbon Almanac for Kids first, which is, by the way, a great resource for anybody who wants to talk about climate change with kids in a non-scary way. And really, as an adult, learn a huge amount, which is a huge place to begin. I think so often we need a good way to begin. And I think when I say kindergarten level, I don't mean it like, I mean like the essential building blocks of colors and numbers, like what is the language we use to start? And so the almanac is basically that collection, a bunch of people who share that attitude, and there's a whole collection of resources based around that concept, sharing accessible information to generate conversations. So the book has been enormously successful. It's become a bestseller in multiple languages, including in Mandarin Chinese, and it's the idea being that people having such accessible information would be able to start, and even in the book itself, which the first section is called Climate Change for Rookies. So just for people who want maybe 1 or 2 pages or a handful of pages, just to begin to know a little bit more and say, okay, I kind of understand how this sort of system is working. What is carbon? Why does that matter? That kind of thing. And so the Carbon Almanac, yeah, it was a huge and continues to be a hugely successful experiment and a collaboration. In that literally it would not have worked had it had an individualistic focus. And being part of it was so helpful in that I think we need models as humans to truly learn things. And unless you really witness it and feel it and experience it, you don't necessarily believe it's possible. But then when you're involved in these amazing communities online, you see the diversity of what can come out of it and the reciprocity and the symbiotic relationships that take place, you walk away thinking, okay, that's completely a game changer. And that's been mine and many of our experiences with it. So in the All Carbon Almanac network, what's called, there's a whole selection of podcasts. There's podcasts for kids, there's podcasts for adults, there's board games and kids' books, there's the actual book itself. Let's see, and then there's YouTube videos, and really what there is ongoing is an ongoing group of people with whom people can connect with who believe this as well. And I think if you have an idea about the future or possibility for your community, for your family, for your species of human beings, that it's possible that in the future we can have a livable planet and a good shared life together. You need people around you with that same attitude to continue that. Otherwise, you're going to burn out. It's too tiring. It's too hard. And I think maybe more than anything else is the community of people who share that attitude, especially in response to so many events going on, so many fires, so much flooding, so many storms, so many scary, scary things that are causing a lot of damage and really hurting a lot. That inner core has to stay intact. Otherwise, I don't think we function. I don't think as a species, and I think it's going back to your earlier question, we have to have that core in order to, I think, to continue. And so that's the Carbon Almanac. I was involved and led and continue to lead the creation of the Carbon Almanac in Spanish. And the history on that is pretty interesting. The book was purchased, in multiple different languages by country-based publishing houses to publish in a language. You buy the rights from the big publisher in New York, from Penguin Random House, and we couldn't find anybody who wanted to publish it. And we struggled, and I was working with staff, and we just couldn't seem to find anybody, even though there's 500 million Spanish speakers in the world, and it was mind-boggling. And so what we did, using the same collective, the same hive, is we actually bought our own rights to the book to publish it for free as a PDF. And so that happened. And the book is now available for free online in Spanish, which we're going to get going. We want to make it viral and get it on as many people's WhatsApps, and it's available for free now. It's a wonderful resource. So people could go to their website and download it. But that's what we did. So there was incredibly generous graphic designers and folks from all in Spanish-speaking world who revised the entire thing and revamped the entire book. Again, I could have never done that on my own. I was astonished at what was possible. So it felt like a miracle, honestly, and continues to. Okay, so just to connect that with the Earthwork Collective, so Earthwork Collective came as a group of people who were volunteers, many of whom still are with the Carbon Almanac, decided to kind of create their own entity to basically find people, organizations, government agencies, and businesses who want to take a more climate-friendly approach on things, who want to develop climate-friendly policies, local governments who want to actually implement things like ESGs or understand what they are. And in Earthwork Collective, there's literally a collective of different people with different skills. There are illustrators, there's photographers, there's designers, who be working with specific clients to help them make, move towards a more climate friendly plan. And so, yeah, they do a lot of focus on facilitation, using different frameworks, a lot related to climate resiliency. And a lot of what I love about both these organizations is it's taking something that is just too incredibly overwhelming and scary to possibly comprehend. It's mind altering. It's too hard. It's too much. And taking it and what can you put inside your mouth to start chewing? What is possible to actually be digested versus me trying to think about floods in other parts of the world, or you people trying to think about the Amazon. It's like too much. So what are the pieces I can chew and swallow? And I think that's what this has done exceptionally well. It's really kind of climate literacy as a way of generating culture change. And they both do that really nicely. A lot of my work has an intercultural focus. So kind of thinking about intercultural conversations, discourses, ways of sort of thinking about different kinds of language, incorporating different kinds of languages. I have a lot of interest in design thinking and marketing, and so offering the perspective that comes from having spent 7 years working in a completely different environment and how that helps affect using an empathy-based perspective and bringing marketing into work. That's a lot of what I'm offering on the council.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I mean, wow, there's a lot there.
There's a lot
So,
there. Yeah.
so yeah, so the Carbon Almanac is essentially an ecosystem of people, communities, and things that all, it's a very Seth thing. This idea
Yes.
of, yeah, this idea of like, we have to talk about this thing constantly so that we can change the culture. That is a very Seth thing that I've picked up. And it makes 100% sense. Like, I mean, how do you change anything? You have to change the culture. You have to change how people think about things. That's why sometimes when a lot of people are like very gung-ho about Planet B, going to Mars, it's like these things are interesting and they are worthy of exploration. But I think we shouldn't lose focus on what we have right here. And I think it's, let's start to realize about all the beauty that surrounds us and how it's going away slowly, and actually not as slowly as we think. We have lost so much already in terms of biodiversity, as you've mentioned, like plants, animals, just environments that has completely changed. So I think we shouldn't lose focus on that. And the way you do that is by changing culture so that people think about these things differently. It's not like it's a place where you go on holiday. It's when you go on holiday, you go to this place where there's nature and all these things. But day to day, it's not important. It's like it's always important. But the other thing that was interesting to me is the word scary came up quite a couple of times. I think scary from two perspectives. The first thing, and I wasn't aware of this, is that there's a children's version of the Carbon Almanac. Like how does that go about talking to kids about this? Because I know like having children that's not really children anymore. I mean, the youngest is 17 and then 20 and 25. But it's a scary topic. It's something that's top of mind for them all the time. And it's scary to think when they are 40 years old, what's going to be left if we don't, if they look at the world, they like, we don't see this planet still being around 10 years from now, never mind 20 years from now. How do you talk to kids about this in a way that doesn't freak them out entirely?
Yeah, it's such a huge topic, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they still have important voices in this, that they're not zero actors in the system. Some of the most innovative things that are happening right now are, to me, things that inspire me the most, with the climate litigation with kids going on. Yeah, it's my future. I'm that age. Like that's relevant to me. It's hard to deny that in a courtroom, even though like they've had mixed results, but I feel like the trend is leaning and the trend is good, getting us. And so I also just think it forces us to think about it differently versus the perspective of an adult as a kid. So I think a lot of it has to do with having agency, having a role, finding reasonable Goldilocks style actions that can be taken that feel doable. Um, Not, finding your own discourse as a family and people being able to really talk about some of the fears around it and emotions around it too as being things that are welcome to discuss. I think offering kids space on how they feel about it, how they're able to engage on it, and reflecting and appreciating what actions they've already taken as a point of gratitude, I know is an important tool for adults and for kids. I think also just for all of us having a basic comprehension of the basic platform of what it is helps us. When you're given basic language to have a conversation, you're able to actually begin the conversation. And so the Carbon Almanac for Kids does a really nice job of kids who can do science experiments at home, understanding what the greenhouse effect is. What happens to the butter when you put a glass bowl over it? How quickly, how much faster is it going to melt? With the sun on it. Those kinds of hands-on experiments I think are a really helpful tool in because science experiments are fun and important. But those kinds of things, I think, but I would say, in my experience, having a nice tool that people can really read together and share together that would generate a sense of confidence. If I comprehend this more now, I feel like I'm not just hearing about the scary news, but I'm also I also understand a little more how the situation works. And I understand that my role is valuable in this. Um, Anytime people are reminded of their right or encouraged to use their agency, it helps us with manage our emotions. It helps us with our outlook. It's not all one way. Um, yeah, and then there's things like we created a board game, which is pretty fun. So the more that it can also be incorporated into regular conversations rather than just a one time and done thing. Oh, hey, today it's really hot. How are you feeling about that? You know, hey, this that the aspect of incorporating the smaller pieces into it each day, I think also breaks it in out of the scary into the sort of the lived real and daily.
Yeah.
And maybe that makes it less overwhelming.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I think it's the thing that you have to talk about it because it is ever present, and pretending that it's not, it doesn't help the situation at all. Um, I think that comes from I for most of my life I avoided conflict by any means that I possibly could, and about 3 or 4 years ago. I did this MBSR course, mindfulness based stress reduction. And one of the things that I was taught in there is that, in fact, avoiding conflict does more harm than addressing the conflict. And I think that opened my eyes to a lot of other areas in our lives where avoiding a situation actually makes it worse than addressing it. And I think this is potentially one of those where it's better to be open about it and talk about it, and then in so doing, maybe make it a little less frightening because we tend to be scared of things we don't know. And so if we talk about something, it becomes known and therefore it loses some of that fear.
So for every topic that you feel like you don't know enough about and you feel fear about, if you increase the amount you know even by 10% or 15% on it, if you read one short article, listen to a short audio piece or something on it, what does that do? I think it's also really hard for kids to feel bad about it when the adults around them also haven't done some of their own getting their own information, or their own openness to the information.
This is a nice segue into one of the topics we wanted to talk about, and that is AI. I think, AI is one of those things at the moment that is scary to a lot of people, and scary because we don't know. And it's even scarier when you hear the people who are the innovators in this space saying, we don't actually know what the heck's going on here. It's exciting and it's interesting and it's weird, but we don't actually know how this works. So I wonder, like, to jump from one scary topic to a potentially another scary topic, what are your thoughts just about AI? For me, I have very mixed emotions about it. Um, but I am curious what role it can play in large data analysis. And I think one of the areas where it could potentially be powerful is when it comes to climate, because there's so much data that it could potentially crunch and it could potentially find patterns and find connections.
Yeah, I do think that's possible. I do think it's possible. I like you share pretty mixed feelings on AI and some level of at times of fear related to it, mostly in its misuse, mostly in terms of the way it can be used, weaponized against humanity. What interests me more about AI is not so much using AI as a critical thinking source to solve climate problems, but letting it do the work that so that the human creative capacity can be spent on solving climate problems. So, what can be automated? What is AI really good at doing? How can ChatGPT be used to really save time and so that I can spend most of my time using empathy and creativity to solve climate? That is what kind of my favorite use of AI is. In terms of AI as a particular problem solver or in a creative component, I don't know. I tend to be less interested in it. I imagine it's possible, but I feel like what we do know about it and what we do know what it's good for are the rote, non-empathy based tasks that humans don't have to spend our time doing. Robots are fine to do. And so we can focus elsewhere. And I guess that's my greatest area of interest for it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I also think so. That's why I think, like, using it for data analysis, like large scale data analysis, is where it could be really interesting. To train it on a large corpus of climate data and say, hey, find patterns in here. That's what machines are really good at, right? Is finding patterns. Find something odd in here, that something that doesn't fit, something that doesn't, what this thing doesn't look like the other. Pull those little bits out of this massive data set that, will take years if humans need to do it. I think there is potentially some interesting things, some interesting uses for AI. And then from that perspective, we can use the human creativity to try and find solutions. But again, also maybe some of it is that culture change. If you know more, you can do better potentially. So if it can be used to get that data, that information that we don't know yet, maybe it can help us then talk about this from a more informed place, which then could potentially change the culture.
Totally. I think the part of that is I think the access to the information piece honestly has never been a problem. At least recently, just with our just with digital access. Like I think what often we miss is the motivation to understand the actual willingness to be uncomfortable long enough to consider different perspectives. I mean, if I don't think AI can't make people be curious, you know what I mean? It can't make you be motivated. It doesn't necessarily. You can have all of the access to the world and not be interested in any of it. And I think that's the problem that it does not solve. Just because you're a high school student and you use AI to write your report doesn't mean you really understood the content. And you have to be interested and engaged with it as a human learner. And what does that really require? What are those things? I need to interact with it in my body. I need to teach it to others. I need to be in spaces. I need to, that's the part that AI doesn't do. And so that is what I'd like for us to be focusing on. You know, what are the specifically human elements that we can be doing, and what can we let AI do for us that don't require that? I'd like to see a better line drawn, better divisions made in terms of that, and not see so much wasted human potential of people who have so much creativity and possibility on things that they don't need to be doing because we want their focus elsewhere.
To cycle back to something else, boredom. You wrote about reconsidering boredom on your blog, and that's a very interesting topic. I find it especially interesting because I also read about that a little bit. Manoush Zamarodi, she hosted this podcast called, what was it called? Note to Self. And they had this, like, a couple of weeks, they did this experiment that led to the book she wrote called Bored and Brilliant. And there's quite a lot of, like, scientific understanding around the fact that sometimes we need to be bored to really get good ideas. And I find that oftentimes when, like in the later part of the day, like in the early afternoon, if I take a break and I just go sit somewhere for 10, 15 minutes and I just put on some podcast that's not super, it doesn't invest a lot of my energy, but it's there in the background and my mind starts wandering a little bit. I often find that a whole bunch of ideas starts popping up from that space, and that space where it's you're almost bored. So I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts around boredom? What have you thought, and what are you reconsidering about boredom?
Yeah, I love this. I love this topic. So yeah, I've done my own kind of experiments on myself with this, and I think for a long time, boredom, in my non-adult, the non-adult version of Anna, which is ceased to exist, I'm proud to admit. She would have thought, oh, this is to be avoided at all costs. This is a problem. Something is wrong. Let's fix it. And I think now in this new kind of more realized version of myself, I would be craving. It's the image that comes to mind. And I think a lot of this is like if you have a gigantic tub of water, and every so often the tub completely drains out, and just all the water comes down. Or if you're cooking and you deglaze a pan, you have all the delicious things, the vegetables you were cooking, and eventually you cook it down to the essence of it, and that delicious, really, that's what you want to eat, is the condensed, cooked down version that's left at the end. And that's to me what a bored afternoon is. It's the draining out of the water, it's the cooking down of the pan, that you're left with what are the creative observations that you noticed randomly? What did you just finally remember about your dreams last night? I think oftentimes having a certain level of distraction, I find this with knitting a lot. If I'm just barely engaged enough that I'm not thinking, I'm doing, there's something going on. I think there's cognitive science like showing this. I believe that if you're just distracted enough that it actually frees you up for certain kinds of creative thinking. So if I'm knitting, I get a huge amount of flashes of ideas. Well, then it's like the right combination of engagement. So reconsidering boredom means valuing the leftover bits, the parts that are still stuck on the pan, the delicious end result of cooking, that is
Mm-hmm.
valuable, and being willing to be uncomfortable long enough to get to that stage. You're sitting on the stove long enough that you get to that deliciousness. I think that's my favorite thing to do. I've written about this in the blog. Is I live on the third floor of a building, and I go up to the roof, and I have this hammock, and I don't bring my phone, and I lie in the hammock, and I usually bring my knitting, and I bring my notebook, and I can feel the water draining out of my brain. There's not much going on. I'm just there, hanging out. In that process, things start to sort of like, you see all the things that have been stuck to the side of the container, all the little creatures and wildlife that are inside the container. So it's like, but only until you've drained it out can you access that. That's hard to, if I'm just with a full brain walking around all the time with stuff happening, it's hard to dig in. You can't see the sea life if you're always above the water.
Yeah.
You get in there.
Mm.
So I think for me, that's and I find that the more I do that, the more creative I get. I also think what complements, at least for me, really nicely is a really like two of my favorite books on creativity. I just finished The Creative Act by Rick Rubin, which is fabulous. And I find a combination of reading that book or like one of my favorite books on writing down the bones. It's almost like seizures of creativity. Like they come, it's like zing, zing in, and there's no phone in sight. It's just me up there with the book and the notebook. And I think sitting for long enough, and people who meditate, have overcome that discomfort. It's a similar practice. I'm just going to stay in this space for long enough that I'm going to allow it to even be possible. I think that's one of the first things people have to overcome. The other thing that's really wonderful for creativity and is obviously, we know, walking. We're some of the most creative versions of ourselves when walking and in movement, really different kinds. So my best ideas often come after I've had a really good dance party, and things just seem to sort of be kind of shaken loose, for floating around, like you've knocked them off.
Yeah.
I don't know. So, but I think the boredom piece, it's also, I think I often find that if I'm bored and I keep looking at my phone, I'm probably looking for something I shouldn't be, like validation. So I don't really need, and just turn off my phone and enjoy my own company alone.
Yeah, I know a lot of people find that really hard. Um, and I think it's just because we live in such a constantly stimulating, noisy world that when everything goes silent and it's just you and you, a lot of people don't know what to do with that. But it is important for us to be able to do that. I think for many, many reasons. But we can start small. People often jump to the big, like, I have to meditate for 40 minutes. Like, no, do 5 minutes. That's good enough to start with. There's this, I don't know if you'll call it's technically a podcast, but it's more like just a little thing. It's called First This is what it's called. And it's like these like little 7 or maybe 10-minute things. The idea is before you do anything when you wake up in the morning is first this, just a little 5-7 minutes that you just spend not thinking about anything, just being, and maybe they'll have one small little message in there for you at the tail end of that. I find that really good to start your day that way. Anna, this is a really good conversation. There's so much more we can talk about, but yeah, we have to end it at some point. So, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking of a question that I didn't send you, but these things happen, and it's if you think about your life before Peru and your life in Peru now, what have you gained and what have you lost?
That's a great question. Well, I think I gained something that I think maybe a lot of us crave, which is the sense of other, right? The sort of mystic other thing, this thing that you wanted, and all of us who have something we want to do in our lives. I want to. So many of us are like, I want to create a business, or I want to have this kind of experience. Some people want to live in other places and have that. Let's see what that's like. You gain the sense of having done something that was important to you, and that grabbing that other, and that's something I have totally gained. And I wish for every human on the planet, I wish everybody in this world could reach out and grab the other and have the ability and the resources and the safety and the freedom to be able to do that. And that is, I wish I have for everybody. It's like a blessing I want to constantly give to everyone on the planet as I kind of, choose my attitude, right? And so one thing I've lost is much of an interest in social media. I honestly never really had it. I've never been a huge fan of it, and I've found it to be really a lot of it with a couple of specific targeted uses, particularly unhelpful. So I have completely lost a connection to this particular social trend online among people I grew up in the States. I have no idea what people are up to with that, and I'm sort of intentionally disconnected, not because I don't care about them, but because that's not my preferred way of knowing about things. I would also say I've lost certain elements culturally of the US, which have to do a lot with kind of comparative consumerism. I'm not sure I ever fully, totally had them, but culturally, when you live somewhere, you can't help but adopt certain things. And I think some of those have kind of gotten shed, like in a bit of a type of skin I've shed, you know? I think I have lost the sort of some of the political heartbeat of conversations that are going on there. And I don't, frankly, don't really miss them. I still actively vote in everything, even in city local elections of where I grew up. I still vote in all those things. So I haven't lost that. And I think being a voter to me is one of my biggest civic responsibilities. But, you know, I've lost some of the political speculation need of the US. And I find that liberating and refreshing. And I find I'm able to redirect my energy in other places. I also have lost some of the consistent ongoing like birthday party attendance with my family. However, we seem to be doing we seem to make up for it, but I do miss that, and that is a big trade-off, living in another place.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that when I posed the question, I wanted to add a little context to the lost part, but then I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't, because it's interesting that for the most part, the things you lost wasn't in a negative view, from a negative viewpoint, because I could have easily have guided you in that direction, and I'm glad I didn't, because it's interesting that everything except for the very, very last bit was actually positive. Both things you've gained and lost, they were actually positive things, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think losing is actually underestimated. I mean, there's a lot of losing that's awful, right? But like a lot of losing, I think we can stand to do. So
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. We
yeah.
carry a lot. We carry a lot around with us that we really don't need to. Thanks so much, Anna. This is a wonderful conversation. I can't wait to share this with everybody who listens to this. And it was really nice to learn more about you and what makes you tick, what makes you get up in the morning. So thanks so much for taking time out of your day to speak with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for creating such an amazing platform to share these kinds of things. That's really amazing too.
Thank you for listening to the Mechanical Ink podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Have something to add? Continue the conversation on GitHub and join the community on Slack. Until the next one, keep all the things open.